Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. Today we're talking about the long-awaited topic of Episode 6, the mud floods, the antediluvian period, and the breakdown of Genesis. Now, the first thing I want you guys to understand is this conversation is going to be sourced by two reference points that I'm going to refer to over and over again, and I highly suggest all of you go out and introduce yourselves to them on a more personal level by reading them. They are the Talmud and Arabic book that has been translated into a lot of languages called the Mother of Books, okay? And basically, what these two books and texts are talking about is the story of Genesis. However, they go into a hell of a lot more detail, and they offer us a lot more reference points and a deeper understanding as to what was actually going on during that period. Now, this ties into the mud floods distinctly, especially when we start talking about mountains and terrain that we see on the face of the earth, and how a lot of people think that these are petrified remains of titans, etc., etc. And it makes a lot of sense. If you look at some of these structures, there's no doubt that the geometric patterns match what we would think a titan would look like. Now, when you start reading the Talmud, it becomes very clear that when they talk about the earth being without form and void, in Genesis, they are actually describing the period in which Satan was battling God for the throne of heaven, okay? And you have to realize God would not create an imperfect place, okay? So when Genesis talks about the creation of earth before there being an event that caused it to be without form and void, right? Why would God ever create something that is imperfect? Why would he create something without form and void? No. What happened was God created a perfect place, okay? And then he introduced the concept of Christ. And when that happened, Lucifer decided he was going to corrupt everything that God had been working for, in turn sending his minions down to the perfect creation of earth. And this is before he launched his actual war on God, right? Because let's think about this from a strategic point. If you're Satan, what are you going to do? You're going to get a foothold in God's creation before you actually launch your offensive, are you not? Of course you are. So what happens in Genesis? The earth goes to being without form and void, correct? And then what's the immediate step after that? The firmament is put in place to separate the waters from the waters, in turn trapping all of the minions that were doing Satan's work on earth. It traps them here, which gets back to my point about this being a prison. You see, the firmament was not implemented until it had to be implemented. And I've also talked about this over and over again as far as it being a simulation and a virus getting inside of the simulation and corrupting everything from the very beginning. It makes absolute perfect sense. Now, if you dig deeper into the Talmud as well as the Mother of Books, it distinctly talks about these creatures that were put here, okay? These entities, these spirits, these luminaries, whatever you want to ascribe them as, because you have to realize there's a lot of books that were never put into canon that talk about all sorts of creatures, okay? They talk about dwarves, they talk about giants, they talk about sorcerers, they talk about elementals, etc., etc. And you have to realize that the Bible, in fact, supports a lot of this stuff. And the reason that the Talmud isn't talked about on a very big level is because it gives you so much detail. And the reason that the Mother of Books is not something that everybody's heard of is because it gives you so much detail. And if you take the time to understand and read these texts, you will come to understandings that most people will never realize. This gets even more complicated because you guys are asking me, I know you are in the back of your mind, you're like, well, hold up, wasn't Adam placed into paradise? Yes, Adam was placed into paradise, but you also have to realize when you read the Talmud, it distinctly talks about there being a period on earth where it was inhabited by a civilization and cultures prior to the existence of man. Now, the Talmud talks about civilizations in the wasteland, which if you read different translations of Genesis, when they talk about it being without form and void, if you actually break it down into the Hebrew, form and void doesn't mean what it does to us. It means a desolate place, like a wasteland, that is void of anything natural that we would determine and see as natural, right? Because you have to realize the sun and the moon weren't in place necessarily at this point, because the sun and the moon were placed within the firmament, therefore the firmament had to be in place first. Therefore, in this period, there was no sun and moon, correct? Because the Talmud also talks about there being plant life, okay? Now, it also distinctly talks about there being no rain. But when Genesis talks about the Spirit of God being over the face of the water, the Talmud goes into even more detail and talks about God breathing mist upon the earth to cultivate the seed that he created before man, because man was not there to till the ground. Okay? Now this distinctly talks about how there was a system put into place prior to our own that sustained a civilization and a culture of people. Okay? And now once this war was waged and the firmament was put in place, God turned that paradise into earth without form and void. Okay? And at that time, he took all of Satan's legion, according to the Talmud and the mother of books, and turned them into the continents. He turned them into the mountains. He turned them into the minerals that we harvest out of the ground, such as copper, silver, gold. Anybody who waged war against him was turned into the elements of earth, including the air we breathe and the water we drink, according to the Talmud and the mother of books. And a lot of other texts, like the Secrets of Enoch and some of the other books that were not included in canon. So what you have to realize is this history that we've all been searching forever to find is there. Now, a lot of people like to talk about, well, Earth is only 6,000 years old. No, the era in which we are living is only 6,000 years old. Because if you start reading these texts, it clearly talks about there being a break between the antediluvian period of time and our insertion into this creation. So like I said, God introduces the concept of Christ into the equation, which causes Satan to rebel. And he sends his minions down to earth, such as the Titans, the dwarves that are talked about in some of these books. All of the creatures of fantasy that you can imagine or on this planet, on this plane of existence, okay? And once that war was started, God instituted the firmament to trap everything that was here, okay? And at the same time, he instructed his angels to cast out Satan and his minions that were in heaven, okay, to the abyss, to the bottomless. And it talks about how they were subjugated there for 7,000 years. Now, what does that coincide to? That coincides to our time period right now. Because you see, this also happened at the same time everything was turned into the elements. So when the war was over, okay, God took everybody in paradise and turned it into... there was paradise. The people invaded it. He turned it into waste and void. And then took those people as a punishment, those angels, those luminaries that waged war against him, and turned them into the elements, correct? And then afterwards, he subjugated all the people, all the entities that were in heaven waging war against him to the bottomless for 7,000 years, which gave him time, okay, to institute Adam and Eve into the equation and rebuilding Earth as paradise. They talk about the moon and the sun being inserted inside of the firmament in Genesis. God created light, and he saw that it was good, and he placed it within the firmament. He created the moon and placed it within the firmament. But if you notice inside of Genesis, it never talks about the moon being good. And there's a very, very good reason for this, and that is because the moon was never supposed to exist. However, because there was a forced division between heaven and earth. See, God never intended there to be a separation between heaven and earth. What happened was Satan corrupted a perfect system that God intended to have. Okay? So God had no other choice but to institute a new system. And because a new concept, which is darkness, was instituted and brought into the system, because he had to do it in order to punish the people that were here and turn them into what we see in front of our eyes, such as the mountains and the minerals, etc., etc. The moon had to be put in the system because he made the earth a void and introduced the concept of darkness into this system. Now, this sets up the insertion of Adam and Eve into the equation, because God has now taken all of his adversaries and turned them into the elements and more or less separated them from a physical existence on this realm and rather turned them into elements of this realm. Okay? And what we see happening is Satan at this time still has influence. However, his minions and everything have been subjugated to the bottomless and have been trapped there for 7,000 years. Now we talk about how, because it distinctly talks about in the Talmud how they are trapped in the bottomless for 7,000 years. And a lot of people like to talk about, well, our Earth's only 6,000 years old, as I said earlier. Well, yes. Our existence from Adam traces back to about 6,000 years. However, this was not the first iteration of this system, nor will it be the last, because there will be a reuniting of heaven and earth. Okay? Now you have to realize that the concept of hell was never originally intended either. The Talmud and the Mother of Books talks about there being a period in which God was creating during Genesis, correct? God created the earth. And the Talmud and a lot of the legends of the Jews talks about there being a sphere of energy or a sphere of mass, a sphere of matter in which God created everything out of, correct? Now, I told you that there was never intended to be a firmament either. He had to institute that to trap everything that was on earth and not let it back into the system of heaven, okay? And not let the darkness corrupt heaven, because there was a period of time where heaven was without light when God introduced void before he put in the firmament. Now, what I'm telling you is the concept of hell was not intended, okay? During this whole time, there was matter that was set aside that would have been used, according to the legends of the Jews, to create an infinite paradise. However, because there was a rebellion of Satan, this energy was used to create the bottomless abyss, the netherworld, hell. Now, it was never man's place to go to hell, according to the legends of the Jews either. It was the fact that we as men were corrupted by the influence of Satan, and the spirit that was left behind when the firmament was installed and everything around us was turned into non-physical material, okay? you have to realize there's still a spirit there that can influence us. And that is where Satan got his foothold in this system now. And this is why he was allowed to introduce the concept of lying and the concept of forbidden knowledge into the Garden of Eden. Okay? Now you have to realize that according to extra biblical texts, Adam and Eve were not the only living remnants of this place, okay? Because you have to realize that God, according to these texts, man was not his first creation that was living on this existence in this plane, okay? He created other civilizations. He created other entities that were, I'd say, different than man because they were soulless. They didn't have autonomy, okay? Now, what Adam and Eve were meant to do was to reign over this creation. And I like to think of these entities that Adam and Eve were reigning over as the Neanderthals, okay? Creatures that don't have a soul. And that's what distinguishes the difference between man and basically the creatures that the Neanderthals are remnants of the antediluvian age. They are a corrupted hybrid of the fallen and the natural world. And that is why Adam and Eve are introduced into the equation to oversee these remnants while at the same time living with immortality in paradise. And that was God's original intention. However, Adam and Eve were corrupted by the influence and the remnants of the influence that was left behind after that great war and after the recreation of paradise. And once the concept of sex, in my opinion, and reproduction was introduced into the equation, Adam and Eve were cast out. Now, I myself have my own theory as to what actually happened, and I'm of the opinion that Satan used and manipulated the remnants that are the Neanderthals, in my opinion, the troglodytes as the Bible refers to them. I think a troglodyte may have introduced the concept of intercourse to Eve and ultimately corrupted the human bloodline. And you see this play out in the story of Noah as well. When they talk about Noah's bloodline being pure and the fact that everything around them is corrupted, that is the bloodline of Adam as opposed to the corrupted bloodline. And you see this scenario being played out over and over and over again throughout mythology. So it can't be ignored. And we also have to realize that there's a huge concept that a lot of people overlook when it comes to holy books and context, and that it's the same stories being told over and over again. So you have to realize that more or less we're living in an ever-repeating cycle. So if there was a creation before us that had to be destroyed because it became so corrupt, it tells us that things can go the wrong way. And that's a horrible scenario for us as the creation, right? But at the same time, God being all-powerful, all he has to do is reset the system, and it's not that big of a loss to him, okay? But at the same time, the more and more he does that, the more and more corruptible the system becomes, because he's building off of the framework of something else. All I'm trying to get at here is, if you think the earth is 6,000 years old, and you have to reassess that and realize that the earth is more than likely a lot older than you think. However, our bloodline tracing back to Adam and Eve is only 6,000 years old, okay? Before that, the antediluvian societies and civilization that existed only existed because the luminaries that rebelled against God came down and took physical form and mingled with paradise that God created. Once that war was waged against God and his kingdom for Lucifer, Satan, to put his seat above the Most High, God had no choice but to put the firmament separating the waters from the waters to seal in the corruption of paradise and not let it back into heaven. Because during that time, God introduced the concept of void and darkness, and for a period there was no light in heaven. And it wasn't until he established the firmament that light could be reinstituted in heaven and Satan could be cast out to the abyss. And at that time, God took everything on the earth that was here, that was impure, that waged war against him, and turned it into the natural resources, the mountains, the terrain, the water, the gold, the silver, the copper, everything you see around us. And because God did that, that spirit, that soul, that force, that evil, will ultimately be able to corrupt whatever God puts into place afterwards, giving Satan a toehold, okay? And by corrupting Adam and Eve, the whole thing starts all over again because man, his ultimate creation, chose to rebel against him, screwing everything up once again. And because the people, not the people, but the entities that were cast down from heaven into the abyss were sealed away for 7,000 years because of 7 atrocities committed against the Most High, you have to realize that our earth being 6,000 years old, according to the Talmud and the Mother of Books, as well as the Secrets of Enoch, tell me very clearly that this cycle before the ultimate battle is about 7,000 years. And nobody's sure as to the actual chronological timeline. But all we can be 100% sure of is if you want to place any faith in this hidden history and these mud fossil records that clearly show us something has happened, you have to realize, man, we could be very, very close to approaching the end of an era and the end of a cycle that we have physical evidence of repeating itself. All I'm asking is, can we open our eyes enough to realize there's a history that's not only hidden, but there's a history that can be revealed if you're open enough to read some of these texts and realize these people aren't talking about mythology, rather they are talking about truth. They are talking about what they hold as historical, okay? And you have to realize that the Talmud is the oldest translation of the Bible, dating all the way back to Nebuchadnezzar. So when they tell you that there was a war being waged in heaven by Lucifer and his minions, and that Lucifer sent Legion down to God's paradise before waging this war, it will also tell you very clearly that there was a civilization before man on the face of the earth, and that the firmament was put in place to trap them here. I highly suggest you guys go read these books. I highly suggest you critique anything I say, because I'm not asking you to believe me. Just do the research. I hope this topic is along the lines of what you guys are looking for. It took me a long time to gather this information, and I know I'm kind of all over the place, but there's a lot of contextual things that need to be done And what I've realized is you just have to take things literally and understand that these people are using words directly because they have meaning. It's not up to me to interpret, right? Just not. I also suggest that you guys go read the Gnostic Bible. It's about 700 pages of information that most people will never read in their entire lives. And it offers a lot of perspective onto a lot of these questions that I know we're all asking right now. Thank you guys very much. Have a great week. I'm going to try to get you guys a part 7 as soon as possible. If you guys can figure out which direction you want me to take things, let me know. Have a great day. Take care and God bless.